The rain had softened to a mist by the time Eli and the hooded woman stepped out of the church hall behind them. The warm chatter of Briar Ridge still spilled through the doors every time someone went in or out, but out here the night was quiet. Again, cool mountain air carried the scent of wet pine, chimney smoke, and damp earth. Eli pulled his old truck door open with a creak and glanced over at her. "It ain't much," he said, motioning toward the faded blue pickup. "But it runs most days." For the first time, he heard the faintest trace of humor in her voice. "Most days" sounds honest enough. That made him smile. She climbed in carefully, keeping the hood up, and folded her hands in her lap. Eli drove without speaking for a while, tires crunching over gravel roads that wound deeper into the mountains. He wasn't much for filling silence just to make it less awkward. Silence never bothered him. In fact, most of the time, he trusted silence more than words, and strangely enough, she seemed to understand that. Streetlights disappeared after the edge of town. Soon, there was only the truck's dim headlights cutting through the dark, revealing bare trees, split rail fences, and occasional glimpses of mist rolling low through the hollows. After a few miles, she finally spoke. "Do you always live this far from everyone?" Eli kept his eyes on the road, far enough to hear myself think. She gave a quiet hum, like she understood more than he expected. "My father used to say people only move to the mountains for one of two reasons," she said. "To find peace, or to hide." Eli glanced at her for half a second. "And which one do you think I did?" She looked out the window. "I don't know yet." That answer sat between them for the rest of the drive. When they reached his cabin, Eli parked beneath a leaning hickory tree beside a woodpile stacked higher than the truck hood. The cabin itself was small and plain, tucked into the side of cedar ridge like it had grown there naturally. Weathered boards, stone chimney, sagging porch swing, and a single yellow porch light glowing against the dark. "It's beautiful," she said softly. Eli looked at the place like he was seeing it through someone else's eyes for the first time. Most folks wouldn't have called it beautiful. It was old, uneven, a little patched together in places, but it was warm, sturdy, and honest. He climbed out and hurried around to open her door before she could do it herself. She stepped down carefully, boots touching the damp ground, and lifted her face just enough to study the cabin. For a second, Eli wondered who she really was. Not because she looked dangerous or strange, she didn't. She looked tired, deeply, bone-tired in a way that had nothing to do with the weather or the hour. The kind of tired that came from carrying too much of life for too long. Inside, the cabin smelled like cedar smoke, black coffee, and old books. Eli moved quickly, suddenly aware of every imperfection in the room. The braided rug near the stove was frayed at the edges. One kitchen chair had been repaired twice. A stack of split wood sat by the hearth, and his cast iron skillet still rested on the stove from breakfast. "Sorry for the mess," he muttered. She stepped farther in, looking around slowly. "It doesn't feel messy," she said. "It feels lived in." That was such a gentle thing to say that Eli didn't know what to do with it. He cleared his throat and set about building up the fire while she stood near the doorway, taking in the room. There wasn't much to see. A narrow table by the window, a shelf lined with jars of dried beans and preserves, a worn plaid blanket folded neatly over the couch, and a row of books that looked more borrowed than bought. "You can sit if you'd like," he said. She nodded and lowered herself carefully into one of the wooden chairs by the table. Eli lit the fire, then crossed to the kitchen corner and opened his cupboard. Truth be told, he hadn't expected company in. "Well, yes." He took stock of what he had. Beans, cornbread from yesterday, potatoes, onions, and a little bit of smoked ham he'd been stretching all week. "Not fancy, but enough. I can make soup," he said. "If that's all right." She looked up. "Soup sounds wonderful." He got to work without much ceremony, rinsing potatoes, chopping onions, stirring the pot while the fire crackled behind him. He was used to cooking alone, used to the rhythm of simple tasks filling the silence. But tonight, the silence felt different. Not empty, just waiting. After a few minutes, he noticed her hands. She had taken off her gloves and laid them neatly on the table. Her fingers were slender, elegant almost, but there was tension in the way they folded and unfolded against each other. Not restless, nervous. "You don't have to keep the hood on," he said gently, not turning around as he stirred the soup. "But you can if you want." There was a pause. Then he heard the faint rustle of fabric. When he turned back, she had lowered the hood for a moment. Eli forgot what he was doing. She wasn't dressed like anyone from Briar Ridge, but that wasn't what struck him. It was her face, soft but wary, lovely in the kind of way that didn't ask to be noticed, with thoughtful eyes and the sort of sadness a person wore only after trying very hard to hide it. She wasn't young in the careless sense. She looked like someone who had lived enough life to know what mattered, and somehow that made her even more beautiful. Eli quickly looked back at the pot before she could catch him staring. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For not asking me 100 questions the second I sat down." He gave a small shrug. "Figured if you wanted to tell me things, you would." That seemed to land somewhere deep in her. She looked down at the table for a long moment before speaking again. "You'd be surprised how rare that is." Eli ladled soup into 2 bowls and set them on the table, along with thick slices of cornbread. The meal was simple, but steam rose warm and fragrant into the room, carrying onion, potato, and herbs from the little tin jar he kept by the stove. She stared at the food as if no one had made her a quiet meal in a very long time. He sat across from her, awkward all over again now that the room was still and the church hall laughter was miles behind them. "Well," he said, folding his hands for a second, "it ain't fancy, but it'll keep the cold out." She picked up her spoon. Then she took one bite and closed her eyes, not dramatically, just like someone remembering something they thought they'd lost. When she opened them again, there was a softness in her expression that hadn't been there before. "This tastes like home," she said. Eli looked at her carefully. "Funny thing about home," he said. "Most people don't know they miss it till they're sitting still." At that, she looked straight at him, really looked at him for the first time all night. And when she spoke again, her voice was different now, less guarded, more real. "You may be the first honest man I've met in a very long time, Eli Turner." His hand froze around the spoon. He hadn't told her his last name. The fire cracked behind them. Rain whispered against the windows, and suddenly, in the little cabin on Cedar Ridge, Eli felt the whole night tilt quietly in a new direction. "Have we met before?" he asked. The woman held his gaze for a long moment. Then, almost like she hadn't meant to reveal so much so soon, she gave the smallest, saddest smile. "No," she said softly, "but I think I've been looking for someone like you for a very long time." And Eli, sitting there with soup growing cold between them, knew one thing for certain. This woman had not come to Briar Ridge by accident. Claire slept later than Eli expected. By the time the first pale light of morning stretched across Cedar Ridge, he had already been up for hours. He'd stirred the fire back to life, fed the hens, hauled in fresh wood from the stack, and set a kettle on the stove. Morning had always come easy to him. It was one of the few parts of life that still felt simple. The cabin was quiet except for the low hiss of the kettle and the occasional creak of old floorboard settling with the cold. Eli moved carefully so he wouldn't wake her. He wasn't used to another person in the cabin, even now. Every time he passed the couch and saw the folded quilt draped over one side, he had to remind himself that the night before had actually happened, that the mysterious woman from the church hall was real, and asleep just a few feet away, breathing softly in the golden edge of dawn, for reasons he didn't care to examine too closely. The thought made the place feel less empty than it had in years. He was slicing potatoes for breakfast when he heard the quiet rustle of movement behind him. "You always wake up before the sun?" Claire asked, her voice still rough with sleep. Eli turned. She was standing by the couch, one hand brushing back loose strands of hair, the old checkered quilt still wrapped around her shoulders. Without the hood and the guarded stillness she'd worn the night before, she looked softer somehow, less like a stranger and more like someone who belonged in the warm glow of the cabin morning. "Most days," Eli said. "Figured I'd let you sleep." Claire looked around as if reacquainting herself with the room. "I haven't slept that deeply in months. That couch can't be that comfortable." A sleepy smile touched her mouth. "It wasn't the couch." For a second, neither of them said anything. Then Eli turned back to the stove before his expression could give him away. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "best not let that become my whole personality." Claire laughed softly and moved toward the table. He made breakfast the same way he did every morning: fried potatoes, eggs, toast in the skillet, and coffee strong enough to put sense back into a person. She sat at the table watching him work, with a quiet sort of curiosity, as though she found ordinary things more interesting than they ought to be. "You cook like you've done it for years," she said. "I've done most things for years." "That sounds lonely again." He set a plate in front of her. "You say that, like loneliness is always the villain." Claire looked at the food for a moment before answering. Maybe not the villain, she said, but it can be a very convincing liar. That answer stayed with him. They ate slowly, and this time the quiet between them felt almost easy. Less like two strangers being careful, more like two people beginning to understand the shape of each other's silence. After breakfast, Claire offered to help clean up again. Eli gave in with less resistance than the night before. Once the dishes were done, he stepped outside to split kindling near the porch. The air was crisp and fresh after the rain. The sky washed pale blue between the trees. Somewhere farther down the ridge, a dog barked twice and then went still. He was stacking wood when Claire appeared in the doorway, now wearing her coat, but without the hood. "You've got books," she said. Eli leaned the axe against the chopping block. "That sounds surprising." "A little." He raised an eyebrow. "I can read, Claire." "I can see that," she said, smiling. "I just didn't expect so many." He followed her back inside. She was standing in front of the narrow shelf near the window, fingers trailing lightly over the spines. The collection was mismatched and worn old history books, mountain folklore, repair manuals, poetry, 2 Bibles, and a handful of novels with cracked covers from years of rereading. But it wasn't the books that had caught her attention. It was the faded wooden box sitting beside them. Claire reached toward it carefully. "May I?" Eli nodded once. She opened the lid. Inside were old cassette tapes, a few scratched CDs, and a folded yellow piece of paper tucked beneath them. Claire stared down into the box for a long moment, then slowly picked up one of the CDs. Her expression changed instantly. "What is it?" Eli asked. She looked up at him in surprise. "This," she said quietly, holding up the disc, "should not be here." Eli frowned and stepped closer. It was an old album cover, nothing fancy, just soft watercolor mountains and cursive lettering across the front. Somewhere between pines, Claire's fingers trembled almost imperceptibly as she stared at it. "You know it?" Eli asked. She gave a strange little laugh, though her eyes had gone shiny. "I wrote half of it." Eli blinked, then looked again at the cover, then back at her. He knew enough not to make a fool of himself too quickly, but the pieces began shifting in his mind all at once. The songs, the way she spoke, the exhaustion in her face, the carefulness with which she seemed to carry herself, like someone who had once belonged to a world much louder than this one. "Wait," he said slowly. "You mean this was yours?" Claire nodded, almost reluctantly. "It was the first album I ever wrote under my own name." Eli stared at her. "Claire Bennett?" There it was. The name hung in the cabin like a struck bell. Claire's shoulders fell just a little, as if there was no point pretending now. "Yes." Eli sat down heavily in the nearest chair. Now he knew. Not because he followed music charts or celebrity gossip, he didn't, but because 10 years ago, when his mother had still been alive and his father's health had already started to fail, one voice had played more often than any other on the little radio in this very cabin. Claire Bennett, the songwriter with the aching voice and mountain lyrics that sounded like they'd been carved out of old wood and weather. His mother had loved her songs, especially one. Eli looked slowly toward the folded paper in the box. Claire followed his gaze and reached for it before he could stop her. She unfolded it carefully. It was old, edges worn soft with time, and there, in Eli's rough but unmistakably careful handwriting, was a line copied from one of her songs. "Some hearts don't break all at once. They weather." Claire's breath caught. She looked up at him, stunned. "You kept this?" Eli rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly feeling like a 12-year-old caught with a secret. "My mama liked your music," he said. "That line. She used to say it helped her through my dad's illness. After she passed, I guess I just never threw it out." Claire didn't speak. She only stared at the paper, then at the little shelf, then at him, and whatever wall had still been standing behind her eyes began to crack. "You listen to my songs here?" she asked, almost like she couldn't quite believe it. "Yeah, back when they still meant something." Eli frowned at that. "Who said they stopped meaning something?" Claire looked at him then with such raw, unguarded emotion that he wished immediately he could take back the pain hidden inside her question. He rose from the chair slowly. "Claire," he said, gentler now, "what happened to you?" She lowered her eyes to the old lyric sheet in her hands, and when she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I forgot who I was writing for." The room went still. Even the kettle on the stove had stopped singing, and in that little cabin, surrounded by books, old songs, and the fragile truth neither of them had planned to uncover so soon, Eli realized something that settled deep into his bones. The woman sitting across from him hadn't just come to the mountains to disappear. She had come because some part of her was hoping to be found. By mid-morning, the sun had burned off most of the mist from Cedar Ridge. The mountain air turned crisp and bright, and everything around Eli's cabin looked washed clean. The porch boards, the woodpile, the narrow dirt path leading down toward the road. A bluebird landed on the fence post for a few seconds and then darted away, as if even it had decided the world felt different today. Maybe it did. Maybe Eli did. Inside the cabin, Claire was standing by the sink, sleeves rolled just enough to keep them from getting wet, rinsing out coffee mugs like she'd been doing it there for years instead of one morning. Eli stood in the doorway watching for a second before he caught himself. He wasn't a man prone to foolish thoughts. He fixed what was broken, stacked what needed stacking, and lived according to weather, daylight, and common sense. But there was something about the sight of her in his kitchen quietly at ease, moving gently through the small familiar space that reached somewhere deeper than common sense had any authority over. Claire glanced over her shoulder and caught him there. "Are you planning to help?" she asked, "or just supervise from a safe distance?" Eli cleared his throat and stepped in. "I was giving you room to regret your life choices." Her smile appeared instantly. "Too late for that." He took the towel from the counter and dried the mugs as she handed them over one by one. It was a simple thing, ordinary, but somehow it felt like the kind of ordinary he hadn't realized he'd been missing when the last mug was put away. Claire leaned back against the counter and looked at him. "So," she said lightly, "what does a mountain man do on a Saturday?" "Mostly whatever needs doing. That's not a real answer. It's the only one I got." She crossed her arms. "Do you ever do anything just because you enjoy it?" Eli considered that. "Split wood." Claire laughed. "I'm serious." "So am I." She studied him for a moment, then shook her head with amused disbelief. "You are a very difficult man to classify. That all right with you?" Her expression softened in a way that caught him off guard. "Yes," she said quietly. "Actually, it is." That should have been the end of it. A small sentence, a passing moment. But it settled inside him anyway. Eli turned toward the window to hide the fact that her words had landed harder than they should have. "Well," he said after a beat, "I need to head into town for a few things. Feed nails. Maybe kerosene if Pete hasn't sold out again." Claire nodded, and then she looked toward the door, toward the road, toward the life waiting for her somewhere beyond the mountain. A strange stillness moved through the room. Eli didn't ask whether she planned to leave. He didn't ask because he was unsure he wanted the answer. She had every reason to go. She'd found what she came for, or maybe enough of it. A quiet night, a kind stranger, a little breathing room. That ought to have been enough. Instead, Claire looked back at him and asked almost casually, "Would it be terribly inconvenient if I stayed one more day?" Eli blinked. "One more day?" She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "If that's all right. I know I've already imposed enough. It's just," she glanced down, "I'm not ready to go back yet." The honesty in that nearly undid him. He kept his voice even. "You ain't imposing." Claire looked up. "Then I can stay." He nodded once. "Long as you don't mind a trip into Briar Ridge." That smile came again, warm, uncertain, relieved. "I think," she said, "I can survive Briar Ridge." The drive into town felt different than the night before. Less like transporting a stranger and more like accompanying someone he was beginning to know in ways that had nothing to do with facts. He knew the shape of her silences now, the way she looked out windows when she was thinking, the tiny pause she took before answering any question that mattered. Claire wore a plain knit cap instead of the hood this time, and Eli was quietly grateful for it. Not because he needed to see her face, though he did, but because she looked less like she was hiding. Still, as they rolled into the center of Briar Ridge, he could practically feel the town's curiosity waking up like a hound catching scent. Small towns didn't miss much, and they definitely didn't miss Eli Turner driving into town with a woman nobody knew. The moment he parked outside the general store, Claire looked out the window and exhaled. "Why do I feel like half the town already knows I'm here?" "Because they probably do." She looked at him. "You say that so calmly." "Ain't my first day with gossip," Eli said, opening the truck door. Claire laughed under her breath and followed him out. The bell over the general store door jingled the second they stepped inside, and right on cue, conversation stopped. Not in a rude way. Not exactly, but enough. Miss Darlene, who was somehow already inside despite having hosted a fundraiser half the night before, turned from the canned goods aisle so fast Eli was surprised she didn't sprain something. Well, she said, eyes sparkling like Christmas lights. Look what the Lord has continued to provide, Eli sighed. Morning, Miss Darlene. Claire bit her lip to keep from smiling. Miss Darlene approached with all the restraint of a woman who had absolutely none. And who might this lovely young lady be? She asked, even though she had clearly been waiting to ask exactly that since sunrise. Claire answered politely, extending a hand before Eli could interfere. Miss Darlene took it with delight. Claire, beautiful name. Then she gave Eli a look, so knowing it should have been illegal. Eli grabbed a sack of feed from near the door. We're just here for supplies. Of course you are, Miss Darlene said. Claire was trying very hard not to laugh now. As they moved through the store collecting what Eli needed, people greeted him with unusual enthusiasm. Morning, Eli. Good to see you out and about. Need help with anything, son? He hadn't received this much public interest in years, and he knew exactly why. Claire leaned slightly closer as he compared two boxes of nails. Are they always this subtle? She whispered. No, Eli muttered. This is them showing restraint that did it. She laughed openly this time, and 3 women near the flower shelf visibly melted. Eli should have been embarrassed. Instead, he found himself oddly pleased that she was laughing at all. By the time they reached the register, Miss Darlene had somehow appeared there again like a matchmaking spirit in orthopedic shoes. You two coming to the harvest supper next week? She asked, scanning the kerosene. We ain't, Eli began. That sounds lovely, Claire said at the exact same moment. Eli turned to stare at her. Claire kept her expression innocent. Miss Darlene looked ready to ascend directly into heaven. Wonderful, she said. I'll save you a table back in the truck. Eli loaded the supplies in silence until Claire finally couldn't hold it anymore. Oh, don't look at me like that, she said, laughing. You were absolutely going to say no. I was absolutely going to say no. Exactly. He shut the tailgate and looked at her over the truck bed. And you thought that required intervention? Claire tilted her head. I'm beginning to think your town is trying to save you from yourself. Eli opened his mouth to argue. But no argument arrived, because the truth was, he hadn't gone to a town supper in years, hadn't planned on going to another one either. And yet now, the idea didn't sound entirely terrible. Mostly because she'd be there. That realization hit him all at once, and hard enough that he looked away before it could show. The ride back to the cabin was quieter, not uncomfortable. Just full. As though both of them had become aware of something unspoken and were letting it breathe on its own when they got back. Eli carried the supplies inside while Claire lingered on the porch, looking out over the ridge again. You really love it here, she said when he joined her. He rested one shoulder against the porch post. I do. Claire looked at him, wind lifting the edge of her hair. I think, she said softly, I'm starting to understand why, for a second. The whole world seemed to narrow to that one line. The trees, the porch, the sunlight across her face, and the way she was looking at him now, not like a curiosity, not like a story, but like a man. She was beginning to see clearly. Neither of them spoke, neither of them moved, but the space between them grew charged in a quiet, unmistakable way. Claire's gaze dropped briefly to his mouth before she caught herself. Eli saw it, and judging by the sudden stillness in her shoulders, she knew he had. His heartbeat kicked hard once, then twice. He could have stepped closer. He almost did. Almost, but just then, from somewhere down the hill, old Mr. Hanley's truck horn blared twice from the road. Claire jumped back a fraction, startled into a laugh, and the moment passed. Not lost, just delayed. Eli exhaled slowly and shook his head. Mountain timing, he muttered. Claire smiled, cheeks pink now for reasons that had nothing to do with the breeze. Seems your mountains enjoy dramatic interruption. He looked at her for one long second. Seems they might. And though neither of them said another word about it, both of them knew the same thing by the time the afternoon light settled warm over Cedar Ridge. She hadn't left, and he no longer wanted her to. The sun was slipping low behind the ridgeline when Eli finally let his hand fall away from Claire's cheek. Neither of them moved right away. The old letter still rested between them, folded now and warm from both their hands, but it no longer felt like the only thing connecting them. Whatever had started with ink and loneliness, and a chance encounter in a church hall had become something far more dangerous now, not dangerous in the way of harm. Dangerous in the way hope always is. Claire's eyes stayed on his. The breeze lifted a few loose strands of her hair and carried the scent of pine, cooling earth, and the faint sweetness of wood smoke from the chimney. The whole mountain seemed to hold its breath. Eli was close enough now to notice every tiny change in her expression, the softness in her mouth, the way her breathing had gone just a little unsteady, the way she didn't pull back. He knew that if he leaned in, even a little, she wouldn't stop him, and the truth of that hit him with enough force to make his chest tighten. He had not expected this. Not after years of quiet routine. Not after building a life small enough to manage and safe enough not to lose again. Certainly not because of a $1 church fundraiser and a woman who had arrived wearing a hood and carrying half her life in silence. But there she was, and there he was, and somehow, without either of them planning it, the distance between strangers had turned into the kind of closeness that could change everything. Claire's gaze flickered briefly to his mouth, then back to his eyes. Eli's heartbeat kicked once, hard enough that he was sure she could hear it. He leaned forward just slightly. Claire inhaled, and for one suspended second, it seemed the entire world narrowed to that single unfinished moment. Then the spell broke, not dramatically, not cruelly, just with the soft buzzing sound of a phone vibrating from somewhere inside Claire's coat pocket. She closed her eyes for half a second. Eli let out the smallest breath of disbelief and leaned back, one hand scrubbing across his jaw. Well, he muttered. Claire looked equal parts flustered and apologetic. That, she said, has exceptionally bad timing. Eli gave a crooked half smile. Seems to be a theme. The phone buzzed again. This time Claire's face changed before she even touched it. Not fear exactly, but dread. The kind that belonged to a world Eli had not yet seen, but was beginning to understand had sharp edges. Claire reached into her coat and pulled out the phone slowly, as if she already knew she wasn't going to like what was waiting there. The screen lit her face pale in the growing dusk. She stared at it, then went very still. Eli watched her carefully. What is it? Claire didn't answer right away. Her thumb hovered over the screen, but didn't open the message. Instead, she turned the phone face down in her lap like she could somehow undo its existence by refusing to look. That, she said quietly, is the part of my life I was hoping wouldn't find me this quickly. Eli's expression hardened, not in anger, but in concern. Someone bothering you? No, she said quickly. Then, after a beat, not exactly. He waited. Claire exhaled and leaned back against the porch post, her earlier softness replaced now by a familiar kind of weariness. It's my manager, she said. And my assistant. And 2 people from my label. Eli blinked. All at once. She gave a humorless little smile. That's usually how it goes. He glanced at the phone. They know where you are. Not precisely. But they know I disappeared. And they know I'm not answering. The mountain suddenly felt smaller around them. Not physically, but in the way that outside worlds can invade a peaceful place just by being remembered. Claire looked out toward the trees, though it was obvious she wasn't really seeing them anymore. I left without much explanation, she said softly. At first, everyone thought I was just taking a few days off. Then when I didn't show up for meetings, rehearsals, recording sessions, she swallowed. I imagine panic started setting in. Eli kept his voice calm. Would they send somebody up here? Claire hesitated. Probably not yet. Not yet. He didn't like the sound of that. Still, he could tell from the way she was holding herself that what scared her wasn't danger. It was being pulled back into a life she had barely escaped long enough to breathe outside of. Do you need to call them? He asked. Claire's eyes shut briefly. Yes, she admitted. Probably. But she made no move to do it. Eli looked at her for a moment, then he said the simplest thing he could think of. You don't have to do it right this second. Claire turned toward him, surprised. He shrugged lightly. Whatever's waiting on that phone has probably been waiting a while already. 5 more minutes won't kill anybody. That got the faintest laugh out of her. You really have no idea how unusual you are, do you? Been told I'm not especially modern. No, Claire said softly. That's not what I mean. The phone buzzed once more, then went still. This time she ignored it. The evening settled around them again, though not quite as easily as before. A little of the magic had been interrupted, yes, but not destroyed. If anything, the moment had simply changed shape. It was no longer just about attraction or possibility. Now it was about choice, about whether whatever was growing between them could survive the reality of who she was and what she had left behind. Claire tucked the phone away again and turned fully toward him. "There's something else you should know," she said. Eli's chest tightened slightly. "All right." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "When I left Nashville, I told everyone I just needed space. But the truth is," she looked down at her hands, "I was supposed to announce a national tour next month. Interviews, appearances, all of it. Everything was already lined up." Eli was quiet. "I think they expect me to come back," she said. "To smile, sing the songs, say the right things, and carry on like I didn't just hit a wall. And are you going back?" Claire didn't answer. Not because she didn't hear him, because she didn't know. That, more than anything, made his heart ache for her. A woman the whole world probably thought was glamorous and accomplished and lucky, and all she wanted was enough peace to hear herself think. Eli looked out at the fading light and then back at her. "Well," he said after a while, "for what it's worth." Claire lifted her eyes. "If a person can't hear their own heart over everybody else's plans," he said quietly, "then maybe everybody else needs to wait." The words hit her hard. He saw it happen. Her eyes filled, not with dramatic tears, but with the kind that came from being understood too directly. Claire smiled through it anyway. "That," she said softly, "might be the nicest thing anyone said to me in years." Eli looked at her, really looked at her, and this time he didn't try to hide what was in his expression. He didn't have the language for all of it, but he knew enough to know this. He cared what happened to her now, more than was sensible, more than was safe, and maybe even more than he should have after only 2 days. Claire must have seen some version of that truth in his face, because her own expression shifted to gentler, warmer, touched by something neither of them was ready to name aloud yet. The porch fell quiet again. The mountains darkened around them, and though the almost kiss remained unfinished between them, it no longer felt uncertain. It felt near, very near. Claire stood slowly, smoothing her hands over the front of her sweater. "I should probably call them tomorrow," she said. Eli nodded, though the thought sat heavy in his chest. "Tomorrow," he agreed. She took one step toward the door, then paused, and turned back to him for a heartbeat. She just stood there looking at him in the dim gold light spilling from the cabin. Then, before either of them could overthink it, she leaned down and pressed the gentlest kiss to his cheek. Not rushed, not shy, just soft and lingering enough to leave his whole body still. When she pulled back, her face was pink and her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. Eli could not have spoken if his life depended on it. Claire smiled at the sight of him so thoroughly undone, then slipped quietly inside the cabin before he could recover enough to stop her, and Eli Turner remained on that porch for a long time after the door had closed, listening to the night settle into the trees, feeling the warmth of her kiss still resting against his skin, and knowing with sudden impossible clarity that whatever happened next, he was already too far gone to pretend she didn't matter.